In 1750, there were many claims to North America. Early colonists, seeking religious freedom and independence from the British, settled along the eastern seaboard. France harvested beaver pelts and claimed the land west of the Appalachian Mountains to the Rocky Mountains as New France. The Spanish claimed Florida and most of the west. Their missionaries and explorers claimed land as New Spain. The British, by way of the Hudson Bay Company, occupied what today is Canada. They too wanted the riches North America offered, beaver pelts, and land to expand their empire. And throughout North America, these invaders from Europe threatened thousands of indigenous people's homes.
There seems to be an arrogance there, and the European land use policy carried with it a certain moral right that the Native American land use did not have.
In 1776, the United States of America formed from 13 colonies previously under the control of the British. But it was clear from the beginning that this new nation wanted more land. That officially happened in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase. President Thomas Jefferson purchased 828,000 square miles from France for about $15 million, roughly 4 cents an acre. But the Louisiana Purchase completely ignored Native American land rights. Plus, there were no clear boundaries of the land. This would eventually lead to conflicts. But with this purchase, the United States of America was much larger, and Thomas Jefferson wanted more.
Yeah, Jefferson's interest in the West is deep. It's quite expansive, and at the time he was arguably the most knowledgeable American about the West without having ever gone there. And it's that drive, that sort of Enlightenment curiosity, which was extremely important in his life, that has a direct role in setting the basis for the Lewis and Clark expedition.
In 1804, President Jefferson sent his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and Lewis's army friend, William Clark, on the Lewis and Clark expedition. Some believe there was an easy water route that linked the Mississippi River with the Pacific Ocean. Part of Lewis and Clark's mission was to find this fabled Northwest Passage before the British, who were also looking for an easy way west. Instead, they found the treacherous Rocky Mountains. They also found new plant life, new wildlife, and new people.
We're interested in the native peoples because we want to make sure that we can make friends with them, enter into treaties and alliances with them for the purposes of trade.
The Lewis and Clark expedition also helped the United States lay claim to what was called Oregon Country, which later became the states of Oregon and Washington. By 1812, Spain and Great Britain still claimed large parcels of land in North America, land coveted by members of the United States Congress called the Warhawks. The Warhawks wanted Florida from Spain and Canada from Great Britain. The War of 1812 between Great Britain and the United States erupted after a long period of conflicts between the two countries. Many Native Americans, like Sauk Chief Black Hawk, fought with the British. They too were threatened by the expansion aspirations of this young United States.
The British, however, by the 1780s, 1790s, first decade of the 19th century, are arguing fervently that this should not be British territory, but that it should be Indian territory. And that's really what they argue for going into the War of 1812.
When the War of 1812 ended in 1814, territories seized by either side were returned. The British did not, however, succeed in their attempt to set up an Indian territory to act as a buffer state between the United States and British North America. With their troubles with the British behind them, Americans headed west. By 1830, 24 states and almost 13 million people made up the United States, And each time the United States expanded, Native Americans lost land.
Things began to change because the settlers were coming in and claiming this area. And it was an area maybe that they gathered roots, so they couldn't go there anymore. So they had to alternate and go to another area. And pretty soon, that area was fenced off and claimed as a private property. And then that's what happened with everything. The Indians were being restricted on to the places that they could go. And pretty soon it came down to where there was very little traveling to the traditional areas.
Americans perceived it to be their destiny to conquer new land. Land claimed by Spain and Great Britain, land where Native Americans lived for thousands of years. This concept became known as manifest destiny and would be used as a justification for American settlers to seek new land.
There was a certain popularity current at the time, and there was kind of a national movement, manifest destiny, call it what you will, where white people were going to take over this vast wilderness. They didn't recognize the native people as people, basically, that they had a culture and a way of life of their own. They just moved in and took it over.
As expansion continued, the United States government wanted to solve what was perceived as the Indian problem. What to do with the Indians who lived on the land white settlers wanted. The debate in Congress was between those who favored moving Native Americans and those who favored exterminating them. The solution came with the Removal Act of 1830, an act that moved all Native Americans living east of the Mississippi River to land west of the Mississippi.
After all, who did it belong to? Not the pagans, not the savages, not the people that grew up outside the European legal moral structure, but to us, the white man.
The actual removal of Native Americans to lands west of the Mississippi happened throughout the 1830s. Thousands died as they moved, and the United States continued its conquest of the West. Since 1818, Britain and the United States jointly claimed the land known as Oregon Territory. But because of their fur traders, Britain had much more influence in the territory.
And in fact, of course, Hudson's Bay Company, even though they had a lot of men in their forts, are not engaged in settlement of families and development of culture that would be rivaling or in contest with native cultures in the 1820s and 30s.
That changed when white settlers started crossing the Rocky Mountains in covered wagons. The Oregon Trail would bring more than 350,000 settlers to the Pacific Northwest by the Civil War. The British left for Canada. News of cheap and sometimes free land and a better way of life spread quickly in the East.
Societies back in Boston, for instance, that would, for the settlement of Oregon, and they would tell how that not only was this a land overflowing with milk and honey, it was overflowing with milk and honey, and of course it's just nothing at all to get across the plains and get here, you know.
The Oregon Trail became known as the longest graveyard in the world. It is estimated that 10 people died for every mile of trail, 1 out of 15. But despite the hardships, Americans pushed west. Settlers had taken all the land east of the Great Plains, and the perception was that the only good land left was in Oregon country and California. The plains were thought to be useless, and after the Removal Act, home of displaced Native Americans. But that too would change with the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, you could get on a train in Chicago and travel to San Francisco much cheaper and much safer than the wagon train. The American population of the West exploded. Once settlers discovered there was useful land to farm and ranch on the Great Plains, Native Americans were forced to move again. What was once Native America was now a series of Indian reservations on land no one else wanted.
What were the people looking for? And what did they do once they got here? And what did our people do when they arrived? Our people fed them, clothed them, looked after them, cured their sicknesses, showed them how to cure themselves, showed them how to plant foods and how to get along in this world. What was done after they got well?
True or false? In 1750, France, Great Britain, and Spain all claimed land in North America. True or false? The Louisiana Purchase completely ignored Native American land rights. True or false? The Lewis and Clark expedition discovered new plant life, new wildlife, and new people. True or false? The Warhawks were members of the British Army. True or false? Many Native Americans fought with the British in the War of 1812. True or false? Every time the United States territory expanded, Native Americans lost land. True or false? The concept of manifest destiny respected Native American land rights. True or false? The Removal Act of 1830 made it illegal to remove Native Americans from their homes. True or false? The Oregon Trail brought more than 350,000 white settlers to the Pacific Northwest by the Civil War. True or false? As the United States expanded, Native Americans were pushed onto reservations.